Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. This story is a Western with elements of mystery and suspense. The central character, Cliff Dennis, is a determined cowboy caught up in a dangerous situation involving a mysterious shooting and a deceptive impersonator. The plot explores themes of justice, identity, and survival. As Cliff navigates a tense chase to uncover the truth while dealing with betrayals and moral dilemmas, the story builds tension through its suspenseful action and the pursuit of a hidden killer. The Man Who Chased Himself, by William Donald Bray. Black Mask, May 1931. A mad chase over western hills for a murderer. Elmer Heil, the richest placer miner on Gold Fork, smiled as the firelight flickered on the orderly array of buckskin pokes. Kneeling on the hearth, he had just lifted the flat sandstone slab that covered his hoard. Then the smile froze, while his breathing stopped. A gust of cold air, drawn into the chimney, had suddenly touched him. At the same time, behind him, there had been the slightest of scraping noises as the cabin door opened stealthily. Fear made the miner's hands grow limp. The rock slipped from his grasp and clattered down. This sound galvanized him into action. He leaped for the rifle on the wall pegs. The vicious roar of A-45 rocked the cabin. The heavy slug spun the slight form of the miner around as if a mule had kicked him. Still whirling, he crashed into the wall. His eyes were hazed, but instinct made him fight. He reached up, groping for the rifle. Another deafening crash. Elmer Heil slumped down. His head fell far forward on his chest. As the masked figure sprang forward from the doorway, the miner's work-scarred fingers slowly relaxed. The killer was across the cabin in an instant. Grabbing up the pokes, he stuffed them into a pair of strong saddlebags. Before the echoes had died away, a lifetime savings had changed hands. The bandit slipped out into the night. There was good cause for hurry. The crumpled figure he had left would have no more use for the pokes, but the law of the California gold camps was swift and unforgiving. A miner appeared at the door of a neighboring shack, incautiously outlining himself against the light from inside. Flame leaped at him. There was a jarring report. His left shoulder and arm tingled sharply as the bullets sprayed splinters from the door. He ducked back. From all over town, men were running out with drawn guns, making in the direction whence had come those reverberating reports. Elmer Heil's cabin stood almost at the edge of the settlement. Before the other men could get there, the killer had time to vault onto the back of a white horse and start tearing away. Sheriff Ben Thurman happened to be among those in the lead. Panting, he dashed up to the Heil shack and blazed away at the blurred white form that was racing off. "Damn everything," he shouted. "He's out of range. Ain't nobody got a rifle? Ain't." But Mariposa Ike, a deputy who lived 100 yards beyond the last of the other cabins, heard the shots and a little later the rattle of approaching hoofbeats. Seizing his ancient Winchester, he sprang out the door. A bullet jarred, chinking from the wall logs beside him. Less than 50 feet away, he saw the rider bending low over the neck of a madly racing white horse. Ike stepped swiftly forward, jerking the rifle up. The rider threw himself on the off-side of his mount, but just then Ike tripped over a shovel and landed prone on his face. The rifle spurted a long streak of fire along the ground. When Mariposa Ike arose, spitting dirt and superheated language, his target had vanished into the blackness that pressed close around the little mountain town. "Anybody see him?" In his eagerness, Thurman's mustache quivered like a rabbit's whiskers. "Go get your horses. Where's Andy and Ike?" "Someone bring up one for me. Get going." "It was Cliff Dennis," someone shouted. "I seen his white pony." A dozen voices affirmed this. Already the town was stirring like a disturbed ant hill. Lanterns bobbed everywhere. Men were catching up snorting horses, throwing on saddles, dumping boxes of cartridges into their pockets. Thurman pushed through the crowd around the murdered man's door. Poor old Elmer. Lay him on the bunk there. Slowly, Thurman pulled a blanket over the still figure. "It's getting so a respectable man ain't safe in this country," he grumbled. The men waited attentively. Ben Thurman was a little fellow, if his weight were measured in pounds. By any other standard, he ranked high. The sheriff's hair and mustache were prematurely white. His deep blue eyes were as clear as a child's, which, added to his diminutive size, gave him something of the appearance of a youngster playing grown-up with a wig and false mustache. "I don't think Cliff Dennis would have done that," Thurman said deliberately. "That trouble they had was fixed up long ago." For answer, there was a disturbance at the door. Mariposa Ike, towering head and shoulders above the other men, pushed his way into the cabin. The lower half of his lean face looked as if it had been pressed against a grindstone. He gingerly felt a swollen lip. "Let's get him, Sheriff." "Who?" "Cliff Dennis." "Look here, it's a serious thing to accuse a man of murder. You sure it was Cliff?" "And it's a serious thing to make me knock a tooth loose," sputtered Ike. "That only leaves me 3 on my lower jaw." Something suspiciously like a snicker came from the doorway. Andy Crossan, sturdy, square-jawed and independent, looked at Ike with a twinkle in his eyes. "Ponies are ready, Sheriff. Don't listen to Ike there. He's 3/4 blind and—" "Yes, I am." Ike slammed a black hat down on the table with a vehemence that jarred the room. His hat flew off when I shot at him. "Now, go set up all night thinking out an answer to that." Andy Crossan said nothing immediately. Neither did anyone else in the room. That was Cliff Dennis's hat. He always wore a black felt with a ring of ventilation holes punched in the crown. Outside there was the stir of mounted men assembling before the cabin. "Let's ride." Thurman started for the door. The men pushed out. The sheriff, flanked by his deputies, Andy and Ike, took the lead. In the starlight, the dusty road stretched away before them dimly. The pace held steadily, at a lope that saved both mounts and riders for whatever lay ahead. Andy Crossan seemed worried. Finally, he turned to Thurman. "Suppose it was. Suppose Cliff did do it. Who's going to tell his sister?" "Maybe we won't have to tell nobody. Don't worry till we get there." They came to a fork in the road. The sheriff dismounted, lit a match, and examined the fresh hoofprints in the deep dust. Going like hell when he passed here, and he kept straight ahead. Ike started to say, "I told you so," then thought better of it. He had just recalled that Andy had made many other trips to the Dennis ranch to see June Dennis, Cliff's sister. Andy's role tonight would be a less pleasant one. There was no real proof against Cliff Dennis, Ike realized, but he was hard-pressed to make payments on his ranch. And just this spring, he had accused Heil of rustling a steer. Motives. From far ahead, a sudden rattle of shots broke the night's stillness. The posse surged forward. Clumps of white oaks and pines flashed past. Rocky fords and rutted curves unrolled under the hammering hoofs. Then, over the top of a low divide, they dashed down into a small meadow and pulled up around a freighter's snorting team. At the sound of Thurman's voice, the driver and Swamper came running up from the edge of the trees where they had taken refuge. Both carried 6 guns in their hands. "Get after that fella," the teamster shouted. "He tried to shoot us up and then went straight down the road towards home." "Towards home?" "Sure, Cliff Dennis. He didn't have any hat, and he had a bandana over his face, but I sees his corduroy vest and them black chaps plain as day. He comes galloping down the road like hell was on his tail, white boss and all. My leaders gets scared and edges off the road. Guess he thinks we was trying to stop him, 'cause he empties his gun at us as he goes past. We jumps, and when he's gittin' away I takes a pop at him. Must have hit his pony, 'cause he jumps like the devil." Sheriff Thurman's pony leaped into his stride at the touch of the spurs. The posse swung in behind. When the rising moon was on the horizon, they topped the western ridge of Tejon Valley and looked down at the lights of the Dennis ranch. Thurman gave a few concise orders. As soon as they reached the floor of the valley, they were to spread out, the main party holding back, until the others had time to circle the buildings. The maneuver was quickly accomplished. Andy and Ike stayed with the sheriff. When a shrill whistle from the other side told them that escape was cut off, they closed in on the houses. There were lights in the Chinese huts, only one visible in the main house. This showed at a front window. Leaving the others to search the outbuildings and the corrals, the three leaders dismounted before the house. Guns drawn, they advanced up the walk. Everything was strangely quiet and peaceful. The moonlight threw long black shadows, but nothing moved in them. Nothing exciting seemed to have happened here recently. Cautiously, they climbed the front steps and Thurman rapped on the door. The sound echoed back through the house. When the noise had died away, a voice from the inside said pleasantly, "Just open the door and come right in." The men on the porch glanced at one another. "That's Lester Darwell, what's been visiting the Dennises lately," volunteered Andy. Most of the time, he stove up with the rheumatics. They swung open the door. By the table, a young man sat reading. His left leg was stretched out stiffly, the foot supported on another chair. His arresting dark-fringed eyes focused with interest upon the sheriff's badge. "Where's Cliff?" barked Thurman suddenly. "He's been out all day, looking for some strayed calves back towards Saddle Peak. Anybody go with him?" "No." "Where's June?" Andy asked nervously. "She went down to Coulterville to do some shopping. The foreman, Foston, drove her down." Darwell got to his feet with the aid of a cane. "I'm here all alone. Now, what do you want?" "We want Cliff Dennis," the sheriff announced evenly, "for robbery and murder." Darwell's mouth dropped open. 3 pairs of alertly watching eyes could find no evidence of unnaturalness in his surprise. "For what are you talking about?" Thurman explained. Outside, they could hear the posse closing in. A weird string of sing-song syllables came from the chink quarters. Running steps dashed across the porch. A man shot into the room, panting for breath. "He's here somewhere." We found his white horse below the corral, all covered with lather, and with a bullet scratch across his haunches. A half-hour's additional searching uncovered nothing new. Then, from down the other road, which connected Teshon Valley with Coulterville, came a sudden murmur of voices. Mixed with them were a girl's tones. Andy winced. June was hearing the news. A moment more, and a light spring wagon pulled up before the house. Paul Foston, the tall, uncommunicative foreman, and June Dennis were in the seat. Beside them trotted a rider on a black horse, Joe Kane, a hard rock miner who had a prospect hole along the Coulterville Road just on the other side of the hill from Teshon Valley. Foston sprang down and helped June out. She hardly came up to the shoulders of the men who crowded around. Her clear brown eyes were flashing. She addressed Thurman. "Where's Cliff? He should be here now." The sheriff tried to soothe her. "You have no proof." She broke in. "Cliff lost a black hat several days ago, and there are other white horses in the country." "But not with a bullet mark on him," Thurman pointed out. "The killer rode that horse. We know that." He called orders to the men to mount. "We'll mosey out Saddle Peak Way and see what we can find. Wouldn't it be safer to let Cliff come in by himself?" Kane suggested. Kane was a rangy, powerful man whose one interest in life was his mine. Only when he spoke of the big vein he was going to strike someday would his deep-set eyes light up. "How do we know Cliff's corning in?" Ike snapped. No one had an answer for that. The sheriff stationed a few men at the ranch. The rest started off up the valley towards Saddle Peak. June, Foston, and Joe Kane came galloping after them and would not go back. The cavalcade wound up the narrow ledge trail at the head of Teshon Valley, coming out upon a gently rolling country that led up towards Saddle Peak. Thurman and his deputies rode together as the men began to spread out. "Did this man Kane know anything about it?" asked Andy. "Nope," Ike answered. "June told me it was just 9 o'clock when they came past his place and he decided to ride over with them. "Now this fella Darwell looks suspicious to me," Ike offered. "It'd be awful easy to get the rheumatiz as an alibi." "Afraid that's no good," regretted Andy. "First place, I don't think he'd do it. Second, he can't ride or shoot well enough to do it." "You fellas ain't arresting many men," observed the sheriff. "How about some of them chinks at the ranch?" "Too little," both his lieutenants answered in chorus. It seemed impossible that one of those slight Orientals could have been mistaken for Cliff Dennis. Cliff was better than a 6-footer, well set up and square-shouldered. The sharp, biting crack of a high-powered rifle set every man's nerves to jingling. The report came from the extreme right end of the long line. Ponies leaped forward, sharing the eagerness of their riders. The posse swung and closed in without command. Side by side raced the sheriff and his 2 companions. The other men made directly for the point of disturbance. The 3 leaders angled out more to the front to head off the fugitive. Shouts and scattering shots told them the direction the chase was taking. They swept over a low rise. The brilliant moonlight brought out clearly the figure of a man on a racing pinto. "Cliff Dennis!" The sheriff swung off still more to the left, taking a course that would intercept that of the fugitive on the other side of the ridge. Behind Cliff, flashes of orange-red spattered the silver-lighted landscape. Cliff twisted about to look back over his shoulder. Andy saw a long-barreled gun upraised in his hand, but he did not shoot back. A few minutes of mad riding, and they had headed him off. Just as they slackened their pace on the far side of the ridge, he dashed over the crest. But he did not see them. Leaping from the saddle, he slid to a crouching position behind some rocks. Cliff Dennis had merely run to gain a better fighting position. 6 guns leveled, the sheriff's party closed in. "Drop it and get them up." Cliff whirled. Then his revolver clattered on the rocks. He knew when he was covered. Under the shadow of a black hat brim, they saw the whites of his eyes as astonishment gripped him. "Sheriff, what the—" The foremost of the pursuers topped the ridge and pulled up. "You're under arrest for the murder of Elmer Heil," Cliff gasped. Thurman recounted the damning evidence. Angry murmurs rose from the gathering crowd of riders. "What kind of a frame-up is this?" Cliff's fists clenched. "I've been out here in the hills all day." "You can prove that, I guess." "You know damn well I can't. There's nobody lives out here. And you and Heil had trouble. I found out enough to convince me he hadn't stolen that steer. Then we shook hands and forgot it." "You know that. Then if you didn't have nothing on your mind, what were you running for just now?" "Who wouldn't when a bunch of men start shooting at you?" Thurman turned his attention to the others. Who started this shooting there was a cutting edge to his voice. "We shot in the air," several responded, but that was to make him stop. "Another lie," Cliff snapped. "The first I knew of this, somebody took a pot shot at me from cover, and it wasn't in the air. The bullet zinged right past my head." "Who did that?" challenged the sheriff. "Who shot first?" Nobody answered. The posse had been spread out. As the ground was broken and wooded, the echoes were confusing. In the excitement, it was easily possible that only one man knew who shot first. And Sheriff Thurman had a sudden hunch. This man wasn't going to talk. He snapped orders. They started back towards the Dennis ranch. The leaders were deep in their own thoughts on the homeward ride. So much so that they paid little attention when June rode up alongside her brother. Had they heard the captive's whispered words, they would have had something else to think about. They strung out in single file as they came back to the ledge trail. This path led across a steep shale slope. Cliff's pony trembled, sensing his master's eagerness. Suddenly the spurs touched. The pinto snorted, then gamely leaped off the trail. Head down, all 4 feet braced, he plunged down the slide. There followed a babble of shouts, wild shots, confusion. In a moment, it was all over. Cliff Dennis had reached the shelter of the trees below and was gone. Dawn found him concealed on a rocky ridge overlooking Tejon Valley from the east. Knowing every cow trail in the country, it had been easy to elude the posse. His expression was grim and determined, as he carefully made his way to the edge of the ridge and found a commanding position where he could look between two large boulders, with only his head exposed. All Tejon Valley lay spread out like a map before him. He saw Foston and later Darwell limping down to the corrals and scouting along the creek, close to where the white horse had been found. Cliff also saw his favorite mount among the other horses in the corrals, but his gaze kept coming back to the limping figure by the creek. Towards noon, the posse began to straggle back. After a rest at the ranch, they went on. Cliff noticed with interest that Mariposa Ike and Andy Crossan had stayed behind. They scouted around the ranch. Darwell limped along with Andy to the lower end of the corrals. Cliff recognized Joe Kane riding up the Coulterville Road towards his shack, then shifted his attention back to Darwell. After a while, Mariposa Ike and Andy started away. Ike took the Coulterville Road. The younger man, the one to Gold Fork, Darwell sat on the corral fence as they jogged away. Both the sheriff's aides studied the country around them carefully. They didn't seem to be satisfied even yet. Finally, Ike topped the western ridge and was lost to view. But just as Andy Crossan came close to the top of the long climb out of Tejon Valley, he made a move that centered all Cliff's attention on him. Andy had glanced around. There was no one else in sight on the road. Then he quickly urged his horse to a clump of trees and brush a short distance to one side. Here he was hidden, but he could see down plainly into Tejon Valley. For the first time in many hours, Cliff eased the strain of constant watching and laughed. "This is a good one. Here's two of us, one on each side of this valley, watching to see what happens down there." A smile of appreciation came over the bronzed face of the fugitive. "Good old Andy, you're using your head. I understand you were just doing your duty by chasing me, but I'm afraid you're going to have a hard time getting Sis to see it that way." Darwell hobbled back to the house after a while. Soon afterward, Andy came out of his hiding place and went on up the road. "Huh," grunted Cliff. "So you're watching him too." Late in the afternoon, Darwell came down to the corrals. He saddled up, rode up the Gold Fork Road, and disappeared over the ridge. The sun sank behind the western ridge. Cliff moved down to the base of Lookout Rock. When the shadows in the valley were deepening from blue to purple, a madly racing rider came down the Gold Fork Road. But the light was so dim, Cliff could do no more than watch the curving line of dust that rose behind his galloping advance. "I'd sure like to know the news he's carrying," he muttered. "But if June can get away, she'll be here pretty soon." Darkness fell. The moon was not up yet. The lights at the ranch were the only signs of life. Then, really sooner than he had expected, he heard steel-shod hooves coming closer over the rocks. "June." She slid from the saddle. "Oh, Cliff, I'm glad to see you safe. What's happened?" "Everything. The posse thought you'd got clear away and were going to call off the chase. It looked as if you were going to have plenty of time to scout around and find the killer, and now it's all spoiled." "How?" "Andy said he was going to get to the bottom of this, that he didn't believe you did it," she went on irrelevantly. "Lester Darwell had something on his mind all day too. Lester rode off towards Gold Fork. Just a while ago he came dashing back with the news that he had found Andy Crossan lying close to the road, unconscious, and with 2 bullet holes in his shoulder." "And they'll say that I did that too," Cliff exclaimed. She clung to his arm, looking up pleadingly. "Cliff, you've got to do something, and do it tonight, before the posse gets back." She shoved a revolver in his hand. "There's a murderer loose, and let's get this straight, sis. Did Andy tell anyone what he thought?" Andy, Ike the sheriff, and several other men had been talking. They weren't so sure you had done it, but now they won't stop to look for proof. "Was anyone with Darwell when he found Andy?" "No, he said he heard the shots and rode up and found him. In that clump of trees about a mile this side of the Higgins place. You know, right beside the road where the trail turns off to the Coulterville Road." "So that's it? Andy got shot because he knew too much, or was just about to find some evidence. He hasn't talked?" "No, he's badly hurt. They took him to the Higgins place." "Cliff," her voice broke. "Maybe he won't live, and," he comforted her awkwardly. "You ride over there. I'm going to get to the bottom of this tonight." He turned away. "Cliff, which way are you going?" "Around the head of the valley, then down the west ridge. If you need a place to hide, you might stop at Joe Kane's. He told me today if you came back, he could take care of you and get word to me. He said you would need a friend." With the country in arms against him, Cliff Dennis did need a friend. In forcing a showdown this way, the odds were all against him. But there was no choice. Quickly, he pushed around the southern edge of Tejon Valley and came back along the western ridge. He crossed the Coulterville Road close to Kane's shack. There was no light. Cliff rode on. Here was rolling country with a straggling growth of jack pines. The south end of the trail connecting the two roads passed close to Kane's place. But its northern junction with the Gold Fork Road and the Higgins place were the points that held Cliff's interest. The Higgins family themselves could not be classed as suspects. A bent, elderly father, two thin, undersized sons, none of these could have impersonated Cliff. But Andy Crossin was there now. Cliff swung off into a branch valley paralleling the trail and quickened the Pinto's pace to a lope. He had no time to lose. Already the rising moon was brightening the eastern sky. Again the posse, rested and with fresh mounts, would be thundering out the Gold Fork Road on the trail of this fresh shooting. But something was due to happen, or might be taking place right now, close ahead. Andy Crossin had been shot because he was on the trail of something that would disclose the killer. Now this unknown would be trying to cover up his tracks. And if there were any chance of Andy recovering, it was most likely an attempt would be made to finish him before he could tell what he had discovered. Cliff swerved up a low hill and reined in under the pines to reconnoiter. Behind him, the moon was just on the horizon. A quarter of a mile ahead was the junction of the trail and the Gold Fork Road. He saw nothing and rode on. Just as Cliff gained the top of the hill, a lone horseman turned off the road into the clump of trees where Andy had been shot. A moment more, and a pale light flickered up against the pine limbs. Cliff pushed ahead. Every sense alert, he heard a faint sound that would have escaped less receptive ears. Away off down the Gold Fork Road, there came a subdued drumming, a muffled tattoo of many flying hoofs on hard-packed ground. The posse was on the way. As silently as possible, Cliff rode to the edge of the tree clump. He could not take the time to dismount and approach on foot. The flicker of light ahead guided him. In a minute now, he would be close enough to see the prowler. Suddenly, a moving object on the other side of the trees caught his eye. He leaned to one side for a better view through the tree trunks. Then sheer astonishment held him motionless for an instant. The level rays of the moon outlined a rider that might have been Cliff Dennis himself. There was the black hat, the dark bandana drawn up over the face, the corduroy vest, the worn black chaps. As Cliff watched, his double raised a 6-gun in a steady hand, aiming at the man who was searching among the trees. Cliff's own revolver flashed out and roared. The range was too great, but the killer wheeled and fled. Cliff's Pinto leaped into the pursuit. As the low-hanging branches whipped at his face, Cliff heard the third man struggling to hold his frightened pony. Then he was clear of the trees. Ahead, the killer was racing wildly. Cliff whooped in sheer joy. The other was running directly towards the oncoming posse. But this was too good to last. The posse was now a rapidly moving blur on the white road. The killer sighted them, swung off at right angles towards the south. Cliff swerved to cut him off. The Pinto raced down into a little swale. Thick brush barred their way. They were forced to circle. When Cliff reached the rise on the other side, his impersonator was leaning far over his pony's neck, fleeing towards the Coulterville Road. Shouts and scattering shots came from the posse. Although far behind, with Cliff in sight, they would follow this chase through. But Cliff couldn't let them catch him until he had overtaken the real fugitive. A racing shape coming in from the left caught his attention. The third man, the one who had been in the trees, was cutting across to intercept the killer. The leader saw this danger, but held stubbornly to his course. The unknown pursuer closed in from the flank. 6 guns barked angrily, in a flaming moment of deadly combat. The third man tumbled from the saddle. The killer tore on to the southward. Cliff raced close past the place where the other man had gone down. "Nerve," he commented admiringly, then set himself to the chase. Dodging every obstacle of gullies and clustered rocks, picking the most favorable ground with the sure instinct of a born rider, Cliff guided the pinto on. Their mounts were evenly matched, but superior horsemanship began to tell. Slowly the gap closed. Once the pinto stumbled over a crumbling rock ledge. Every muscle in Cliff's body tightened as he thought of the posse racing behind him. But the game pony recovered, leaping forward as if eager to make up for this loss. Dark clumps of brush, open grassy places, low hills and lone trees flashed past. They must be almost to the Coulterville road. Slowly but steadily, the pinto gained. On the crest of a rise, their figures outlined against the night sky. The end came. The killer's horse broke. He reined about, trapped but fighting. With drawn guns, both held their fire. Cliff did not slacken his pace. Like a flash, he closed in. The double concussion sounded like a single blast. Again, venomous streaks of flame shot out. The masked killer's gun belched a flashing stream of fire. At this smoke-obscured target, Cliff shot coolly and with deadly aim. The killer suddenly straightened up. He flung one arm upward. His hat flew off. The bandana slipped down from his face. He plunged from the saddle. At that moment, Cliff's pinto staggered. As the pony went down, he saw the face of his double, Joe Kane. Then Cliff catapulted headfirst out of the saddle and came to a sudden stop against a large boulder. Helping hands lifted him to his feet. He felt as if the whole top of his head had been pushed down over his eyes. Finally, the ringing in his ears stopped. He could hear what was going on around him. Joe Kane's disguise was conviction enough. His cabin was close by. Mariposa Ike came galloping back with some men who had turned it inside out and found the stolen pokes of dust. Lester Darwell, limping on his right leg now, came up to Cliff. It was a minute before Cliff could grasp the fact that Darwell had been the man in the tree clump, and also the one who had tried to head Kane off. "I got to wondering about that white horse," Darwell was explaining excitedly. "So did Andy Crossin. He went to look for evidence along the road. Kane must have been watching and shot him the same as he tried to get me tonight. You know what was in that clump of trees?" "What?" Cliff asked. "Signs that a horse had been tied there last night. Joe Kane stole the white horse, rode him to Gold Fork, let himself be recognized for you. Then he came out the road to where the trail to his place cuts off. There he changed horses. His own pony was tied back in the trees and turned the white horse loose to go home by himself." "It was clever work," Sheriff Thurman put in. "That way he had an alibi that looked watertight, especially since he joined June Dennis and Foston last night when they were passing his place. No man could have ridden all that way back from the Dennis Ranch in that time. Come on, fellas, let's ride over to Higgins and see how Andy's getting along." Explanations all around took up their attention until they were almost to the Higgins Ranch. Then Cliff thought of something he had seen in the heat of the chase, how awkwardly Darwell had shot at Kane when he was trying to head him off. It came to Cliff that Darwell had just recently come from the east. "Say," he began suddenly, "did you ever shoot a 6-gun before?" "Why, sure I have." "How many times?" persisted Cliff. "Once," Darwell admitted. "I shot at a tree the other day." "Did you hit it?" queried Thurman very softly. "No." Then Darwell brightened. "But it wasn't a very big tree." "Hell!" exploded the sheriff. Cliff whistled. "You'd be a good man even if you had rheumatism all over." Darwell laughed. "I believe I'm cured. My left knee was stiff until Kane shot me in the right leg. Since then, I haven't even felt the rheumatism. Funny. The doctors never thought of that treatment. Andy Crossin had recovered consciousness and would pull through all right. June was there, taking care of him. While Cliff told her in whispers what had happened, Andy stirred and opened his eyes. June dropped on her knees beside the bed. Cliff started to say something, then turned and tiptoed hurriedly towards the door. "I must have got the habit," he told himself with a smile. "Here I've been hunting myself all over the country, and now I end up by chasing myself out of the room." End of The Man Who Chased Himself by William Donald Bray.